After some time had passed, Ari Shaffir called Bobby Lee and told him that he was sorry for everything he had done and understood that if he never wanted them to see each other again, that was completely fair. They would go their separate ways and not get into any more conflicts. But he also said that if Bobby was open to it, he would like to be friends again. It seems that time had also helped Bobby himself mature and grow as a person, as he forgave Ari, saying that his resentment had long since subsided and he would like to be friends as well. After 5 long years of continuous back and forth, the two comedians once again became friends and went right back to the way things were before that fateful night at the Comedy Store. And they've since talked about this saga numerous times. When speaking about successful podcasters, the uncontested king of the genre is Joe Rogan. His name is almost synonymous with podcasting itself, with Rogan helping to pioneer the format that would eventually come to define much of the internet's content consumption, long before every semi-successful comedian and washed-up YouTube celebrity had a podcast, obviously not including myself, of course. It was an extremely niche genre, only available to those with the technical expertise and expensive equipment required to make something that didn't sound like it was recorded with a 2007 Xbox 360 mic, and then edit it into an easily consumable form. The story of the first interaction between Bobby Lee and Joe Rogan begins back in 2011. In only the 76th episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, Bobby Lee and Rogan discuss the infamous story of how they met. The episode began with Bobby apologizing to Rogan for another more recent drama he had been at the center of. Bobby, believing Rogan was angry with him, said that he was sorry for getting involved in it and that he should have kept his mouth shut. The reason why? Well, just a few months earlier, Joe Rogan had confronted Carlos Mencia for allegedly stealing jokes from other comedians. The whole interaction was caught on camera, and after it was uploaded, many other comedians began to chime in, alleging that Mencia had stolen material from them as well. If you'll recall from earlier, Carlos Mencia was one of the first people to give Bobby Lee a shot in the comedy industry, and even took him on the road for comedy tours. Because of this, Bobby likely believed that he owed Carlos a lot for helping him out in the past, so in retaliation, he would upload a video of himself defending Mencia. Essentially, Bobby said that Carlos, in fact, did not steal any material, and was actually just a super swell guy.
And I've never seen him steal a joke. He never stole a joke from me, and I don't know where Joe Rogan gets the information that I called him to tell him that Carlos steals, because I never called Joe.
Considering the mountain of evidence people had against Mencia as far as plagiarism, it probably comes as no surprise that things didn't go over well with the fans. The video was originally uploaded in 4:3 aspect ratio due to that being the most popular and widely used format at the time. So when viewed on a modern display, it looks like the video is poorly cropped with large black bars on both sides. The top comment on the video accurately represents the sentiment of the general audience by jokingly asking if anyone has the full 16:9 widescreen version of the clip, because it appears that the gun being pointed at Bobby's head by Carlos Mencia is cropped out. Despite Bobby Lee seemingly believing that Joe Rogan would be mad at him for the video, Rogan didn't appear fazed, likely because he knew Bobby was lying to cover his friend's ass. Considering that there was video evidence of Bobby and Rogan together, where he said that Carlos had stolen jokes in the past.
Yeah, Ned.
Do a couple minutes of his material, okay?
Well, I'll just do some of my material and then it'll be the same. So.
Funnily enough, in the very same clip, Rogan chastises Bobby, saying people like him, who are afraid of confrontation, are the reason comedians get away with stealing jokes. With the potential beef squashed, the two began to discuss the story of their first meeting. There have been several other occasions since this episode where both Bobby and Joe have retold this story, and both of them appear to change minor details many times over the years, either in an effort to paint themselves in a more positive light, or because it's been so long they've genuinely forgot. Bobby would even end up stating that Joey Diaz was there, to which Diaz immediately responded saying he wasn't. Surely Bobby would know that such an obvious lie would be immediately discredited, so it seems far more likely that with age he's forgotten some of the details of their encounter. Either way, they both seem to agree on the events in the 76th episode of the JRE podcast, so that's what most people consider to be the true series of events. The interaction is a perfect example of Bobby's tendency to talk big, and how that's caused him many issues since the very beginning of his life, getting to the point where Bobby could have created a timeline where Joe Rogan is buried in a shallow grave somewhere in the Mexican desert, and the Joe Rogan Experience never even existed. It goes back to the year 1996. At this time, Bobby was 23 and currently working as a doorman in San Diego. He'd only been doing comedy for a very short time and had only managed to move out of his hometown of Poway, California, a mere 2 months prior. While living in San Diego and performing sets at the local clubs, he got the once-in-a-lifetime chance to meet up with Joe Rogan. Now keep in mind, this is far before Rogan would become a household name. At this time, he was still going around the country doing stand-up gigs, and it just happened that Rogan arrived in town to do a set at the Comedy Store the very same night as Bobby Lee. At the club, he met up with Bobby and another comedian, Jimmy Schubert, who was also performing at the same location. After a successful night at the club, the three of them decided it would be a good idea to hit the nearby strip club to keep the night going. While Joe and Bobby were sober, Jimmy Schubert had a few drinks in him and decided to ask for a private lap dance from one of the strippers. As Jimmy was talking to the dancer, Joe happened to overhear some other people talking about how the stripper was the girlfriend of one of the local Mexican gangbangers who were also at the strip club. He looked over to see the gang members and noticed they were very obviously the real deal. All of them were jacked and well armed, each of them sporting the notorious tear eye tattoos. Rogan looked at one of them who had what he described as crazy murderer eyes, and this was enough to convince him to leave the club right then and there. After noticing what Jimmy was doing, one of the gang members came over to confront Jimmy, and he began profusely apologizing. Seeing the gang member accost Jimmy, Bobby Lee turned to Rogan and started saying that the guys weren't, and they were obviously who were just bluffing.
He said this quite loudly, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, and after hearing Bobby, the other members of the gang started to get up and approach them.
Joe told Bobby that he was leaving right there without them, and if either of them wanted to come, they had to leave right then because they were moments away from being shot. This was enough to get both of them to quickly leave the club.
He was so incredulous, even now we were waiting to get in the car. You guys are overreacting. I'm like, get in the
I don't know what was wrong
car.
with you. Yeah.
I'm like, I've seen murderers before. I've met them.
Yeah,
There's a certain tweak in a person's eye when they've already killed somebody.
What's important to remember is that this happened back in the 1990s when you didn't need a passport to cross the Mexican border. The strip club they were in just so happened to be about 20 minutes away from Tijuana, a Mexican city known for being a hotspot of illegal activity. Despite them managing to end the night with their heads still attached to their bodies, fate would have it that this wouldn't be the only time Lee would have trouble stemming from the city of Tijuana. Anyone who spent a decent amount of time online is very likely familiar with the phrase, "the internet never forgets." That isn't entirely true. To this day, we still don't know where the infamous Jeff the Killer image came from. That being said, there is a growing culture of people who seek to find old dirt on others to harm their career. It seems that currently, the best way to gain some quick internet clout is to expose somebody for something they did in the past. There's been countless examples of this in the past few years, especially with comedians having their past edgy jokes, or more seriously, misdeeds from years or decades prior being wheeled out in front of a new audience. And Bobby Lee's no exception, but he is a very unique case. All the way back on November 17th of 2014, Bobby Lee would make a guest appearance on the DVD ASA podcast hosted by David Cho and Asa Akira. For the first half of the podcast, Bobby talks with the host about random topics and current events, but trouble begins halfway through when he starts to tell a story that would eventually come back to haunt him. Before he even started the story, Bobby Lee would joke that this story could, quote, ruin his career. If only he knew how true that was. Bobby claimed that he used to work at a restaurant in Tijuana, as it was very close to where he grew up. He said that back when he was younger in the 1990s, you didn't need a passport across the border, so it was incredibly easy to go back and forth between his home and work. Apparently, in Tijuana, there was a place close to the restaurant that the locals referred to as Hooker Alley, where there were a lot of girls working as women of the night. Bobby said that since he wasn't familiar with the area or the people, he wasn't aware of any of the girls' ages. He claims that when he was younger, he didn't talk to any girls, and he was still a virgin at the time he was working at this restaurant. So he wanted to go to this alley and finally get with a girl, in exchange for payment. After managing to work up the courage to go there, Bobby said he walked around the alley until he saw a girl facing a brick wall and knew that she was the one. The reason he chose her was apparently because she seemed scared, and that made Bobby want to be with her. According to Lee, the girl looked like Natalie Portman from the movie Leon the Professional, and quipped that she was actually not that young, but I don't know how old. Bobby said that the girl grabbed his shirt and asked if he wanted her services, which he agreed to, so they both went into a room together. After finishing the story, Bobby said that he felt bad about the whole thing afterward, and the two hosts joked around for a bit before Asa jokingly said, maybe she wasn't a hooker, maybe she was waiting for her mom, before they moved on to another topic. The episode was uploaded to the DVD ASA podcast channel without much controversy and was received well at the time. This would change 6 years later on August 7th, 2020, when a Reddit user would upload the clip to Streamable before posting the clip to the subreddit r/standup with the title, Bobby Lee admits to raping a child prostitute in Tijuana, where it would accumulate 1,800 Reddit Chungus updates over the next 3 years.
I'm gonna be completely honest with you.
this story could ruin my career. So there's a street in back of Adelita, and we used to call it Hooker Alley. Hooker Alley had the really ugly ones that couldn't go in.
Nice.
And they had girls that we didn't know what their ages were. And at the end of the thing, there was this girl, and she had her face toward the brick wall. That's when I knew she was the one. And I go, hey, and she goes, you want to, boom, boom, whatever? I go, yeah.
Maybe she wasn't even a hooker. Maybe she was like waiting for her mom.
After the Reddit post, Bobby Lee would appear on a 2020 episode of This Past Weekend, a podcast created by comedian Theo Von. Probably deciding it wasn't a great idea to have his name attached to that Reddit post, Bobby would once again tell the exact same story to Theo Von, with the only difference being that in this retelling of the story, the girl was an adult. Again, this didn't cause any controversy and the episode was well received by fans. It would be another 3 years before the original 2014 clip would reappear and begin outrage once again. While we can't say why exactly it resurfaced when it did, the most likely explanation was that Bobby was hitting a bit of a high. He was gaining a lot of public media exposure while doing interviews for his role in the upcoming Hulu original show Reservation Dogs, meaning that anyone looking to get the maximum amount of attention for exposing Bobby would want to do it at that time since there were so many eyes on him. The second round of outrage began on December 15th, 2022 when a TikTok user going by the handle @I'mJustXander posted a version of the Tijuana story he summarized and then ended by calling Lee a pedo. This clip managed to garner over 2.4 million views in 4 months. Then, once again, the allegation was brought up a few months later on February 9th, 2023, after another TikToker going by the name @ThePodcastPoppy posted a clip from the second retelling of the story with Theo Von that gained an equally large amount of views with over 1.4 mil in 2 months. With so much coverage of this event, many mainstream publications smelled blood in the water and began to publish stories about the current Bobby Lee controversy on websites like Crack.com and USA Today. With a lot of mounting criticism over the clip, Bobby Lee would be confronted by the media in 2023, who demanded a response. He vehemently denied any allegations and then claimed that none of this actually happened and it was simply a story that he made up for shock value.
So, at the time I had 2 jokes in my act, right? Yeah. The first joke, and they would only work maybe 40%, 30% of the time. The first joke was, it's not as bad. It's like, I went on a date the other day. She seemed pretty young. She looked like Natalie Portman. Pause.
Puppy.
Yeah.
From the movie Professional, right?
Laugh.
It's a switch.
Yeah.
That's what that kind of joke is.
Bobby responded to the media by saying that the Tijuana story was a combination of 2 different unsuccessful jokes he had told in past tours. The first part of the fake story came from a joke he told about going on a date with a young girl who looked like 12-year-old Natalie Portman from Leon the Professional, which is why he made that comparison. He then said that the second portion of the joke about the girl crying came from a bit he had previously done about speeding up the process of intercourse with his ex-girlfriend, who started crying in the middle of the act because she had begun thinking about her recently deceased grandma. After responding to the media, Bobby would address the situation on an episode of Tiger Belly and make a formal apology, saying, "I understand the uproar and why people are upset about it. I'm upset about it and I punish myself over it every second of every day. At the end of the day, it's not real and I didn't do anything." Bobby also addressed why he chose to even tell the story on the podcast episode in the first place, saying that back then he was often encouraged to say crazy stuff without actually thinking about the consequences of it.
What happened before was like they make fun of you, and so I wanted to get ahead of it, and I was like, no, I'm gonna rip myself apart. And the second thing I did was, I'm just gonna say the craziest they've ever heard, because that's what that show was. You have to understand it was before cancel culture, and the things that we're saying were, at a high level of shock.
He finished up with a formal apology, reiterating how remorseful he was for the harm he caused, and finally saying, "When I listen back to it now, it puts a chill down my spine." Interestingly enough, before Bobby himself even officially responded to the story, Ethan Klein from H3 Productions said on the H3 podcast that he had previously spoken to Lee about the story, and that Lee claimed it was a joke. Bobby Lee had been on the H3 podcast several times over the years and could be considered a semi-regular guest on the show. He likely considered Ethan a friend, which explains why he would tell him before going public with a response. Whether you consider this to be cancel culture gone awry or righteous condemnation for a tasteless joke is up to your interpretation, but regardless of where you fall, it's safe to say that this is yet another case of Bobby's tendency to open his mouth when he shouldn't, leading to yet another instance of him digging his own grave. After Fox canceled Mad TV in 2009, Bobby continued to perform stand-up and made appearances in many different television and film productions. While these gigs weren't nothing, they weren't the kind of thing that was going to make Bobby a household name. So his next big break came in 2015 when he started doing this podcast named Tiger Belly. Podcasting had already proven to be a successful way of making money, pioneered by figures like Joe Rogan, and many stand-up comedians were choosing to start their own podcasts as a way of reaching more people through the internet than they traditionally could have through in-person events and shows. And on top of that, podcasts were more stable income outside of touring. They could even help promote a tour. Bobby Lee first pitched his podcast idea to the All Things Comedy Network that had been co-created by fellow comedian Bill Burr. He was immediately signed on by the network, but reportedly never had the time to meet with the agency in person. During this time period, Lee and his then partner Kalila Kuhn were in the Philippines visiting Kalila's parents. While they were there, Kuhn began to suffer from severe heart issues. Due to this, she spent weeks at a time in the hospital and was unable to return to her previous nursing job. With all of this newly found free time and her need to stay home, Kalila chose to start a podcast to keep her busy. Bobby would occasionally make appearances on her show as a guest, and reportedly, their chemistry together was so great that Lee opted to spend time focusing on the podcast together with Kuhn in lieu of his acting and stand-up jobs. The podcast began to grow massively, and as Tiger Belly gained more and more fans, it became apparent that they would need more help to handle such a large operation. They decided to enlist the help of Bobby's friend Gilbert, who he had met at a Manny Pacquiao boxing match. Later on in the podcast run, Bobby would also take on George Kimmel to be the producer for Tiger Belly, whom Bobby met while he was working as a producer for The Station, a comedy channel under Disney's Maker Studios division. To anyone unfamiliar with the LA comedy scene, the name Brendan Schaub is almost synonymous with failure. Holding the impressive title of having 2 of the lowest rated comedy specials of all time, there are very few people who have managed to garner as much resentment and disdain as Schaub has. If you're unaware of Schaub and just hearing this for the first time, you might mistakenly believe he gained this notoriety because of political takes or some sort of previous cancellation from years ago. You know, typical comedian stuff, right? But unlike many other hated comedians like Amy Schumer, Brendan has managed to make himself reviled by every stripe of the political spectrum without so much as opening his mouth about politics.
And you
The
have
best term to describe Brendan would be jack of all
happen to
trades,
you,
master of
kind
none.
of start
Though in this case, it would be
questioning,
more
what the heck was
accurate to
going
say
on. So it's
jack
just
of all
been this
trades,
unraveling
relative failure
of
at many. Transitioning from MMA fighting to stand-up comedy.
I wanted to
Schaub
include my
considers himself
sister
a
in here.
podcasting genius.
She
However,
does
most king of the
broadcasting. She
genre
does
is
news
Joe
and traffic
Rogan.
from
His
coast
name
to
is almost
coast on different
synonymous
radio
with
stations.
podcasting itself, with Rogan helping to pioneer the format that would eventually come to define much of the internet's content consumption, long before every semi-successful comedian and washed-up YouTube celebrity had a podcast, obviously not including myself, of course. It was an extremely niche genre, only available to those with the technical expertise and expensive equipment required to make something that didn't sound like it was recorded with a 2007 Xbox 360 mic and then edit it into an easily consumable form. The story of the first interaction between Bobby Lee and Joe Rogan begins back in 2011. In only the 76th episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, Bobby Lee and Rogan discuss the infamous story of how they met. The episode began with Bobby apologizing to Rogan for another more recent drama he had been at the center of. Bobby, believing Rogan was angry with him, said that he was sorry for getting involved in it and that he should have kept his mouth shut. The reason why? Well, just a few months earlier, Joe Rogan had confronted Carlos Mencia for allegedly stealing jokes from other comedians. The whole interaction was caught on camera, and after it was uploaded, many other comedians began to chime in, alleging that Mencia had stolen material from them as well. If you'll recall from earlier, Carlos Mencia was one of the first people to give Bobby a shot in the comedy industry, and even took him on the road
Disney
for comedy
Lucasfilm
tours.
have
Because of
committed
this,
countless
Bobby likely
crimes in
believed
their
that he owed
barbarous
Carlos a lot for helping him out in the past. So in retaliation, he would upload a video of himself defending
I'm not on
Mencia.
steroids.
Essentially, Bobby said that Carlos, in fact, did not steal any material and was actually just a super swell guy.
I've never seen him steal a joke.
Seemed
He
rather
never stole a
obvious
joke
why
from
people
me,
like
and I don't know
Logan
where
Paul.
Joe Rogan gets the information that I called him to tell him that Carlos steals, because I never called Joe.
Considering the mountain of evidence people had against Mencia as far as plagiarism, it probably comes as no surprise that things didn't go over well with the fans. The video was originally uploaded in 4:3 aspect ratio due to that being the most popular and widely used format at the time. So when viewed on a modern display, it looks like the video is poorly cropped with large black bars on both sides. The top comment on the video accurately represents the sentiment of the general audience by jokingly asking if anyone has the full 16:9 widescreen version of the clip, because it appears that the gun being pointed at Bobby's head by Carlos Mencia is cropped out. Despite Bobby Lee seemingly believing that Joe Rogan would be mad at him for the video, Rogan didn't appear fazed, likely because he knew Bobby was lying to cover his friend's act. Considering that there was video evidence of Bobby and Rogan together, where he said that Carlos had stolen jokes in the past.
Autogen is a project by Microsoft that allows you to create as many autonomous agents as you want and have them work together to do things.
Funnily enough, in the very same clip, Rogan chastises Bobby, saying people like him, who are afraid of confrontation, are the reason comedians get away with stealing jokes. With the potential beef squashed, the two began to discuss the story of their first meeting. There have been several other occasions since this episode where both Bobby and Joe have retold this story. and both of them appear to change minor details many times over the years, either in an effort to paint themselves in a more positive light, or because it's been so long they've genuinely forgot. Bobby would even end up stating that Joey Diaz was there, to which Diaz immediately responded saying he wasn't. Surely Bobby would know that such an obvious lie would be immediately discredited, so it seems far more likely that with age he's forgotten some of the details of their encounter. Either way, they both seem to agree on the events in the 76th episode of the JRE podcast, so that's what most people consider to be the true series of events. The interaction is a perfect example of Bobby's tendency to talk big, and how that's caused him many issues since the very beginning of his life, getting to the point where Bobby could have created a timeline where Joe Rogan is buried in a shallow grave somewhere